The first thing the Vethari delegation noticed about Sergeant Mara Kessler was the scar. It ran from the outer corner of her left eye, down her cheekbone, and curved under her jaw like a river on a military map. Not the clean laser erasure of a modern battlefield wound. Old work. The kind that said whoever did it had been close enough to smell her breath, and that she had not let them finish. Ambassador Veltarn studied her through 3 of his 4 eyes. The fourth, the lateral one set behind his ear ridge, tracked the rest of the human security team assembling at the docking bay threshold. 22 personnel in total, well-equipped, professionally still, but it was the one with the scar he kept returning to. "That one," he said to Commander Issel, the human liaison. "What is her designation?" "Sergeant First Class Mara Kessler, 8 years in the 14th Rapid Response Battalion, 2 tour of the Kepler Corridor conflict, 1 rotation on Ganymede Station during the food riots, decorated 3 times." Commander Issel paused with the precision of someone choosing the placement of their next sentence. "She also holds the only perfect score in close quarters protective assessment our program has produced in 11 years. "She has been damaged," Veltarn said. "Yes, sir, she has." "Damaged things break." Issel looked at him steadily, with the expressionless professionalism of a man who had spent years being politely underestimated by various alien dignitaries. "With respect, Ambassador, in our experience, damaged things have already proven they don't." Veltarn considered this. The Vethari had a phrase, "a vessel that has survived the pressure test holds." He had not thought humans capable of understanding such logic with their bodies, as a concept applied to living things rather than manufactured ones. He was beginning to reconsider. "We will take her," he said, "and the rest of your standard complement." He did not think he was making a decision that would matter beyond scheduling and logistics. He was wrong. The Vethari royal delegation was in transit between the Procyon system and the Terran, Accord's neutral station at Meridian 7, a diplomatic stopover of 3 standard days designed to facilitate final treaty language on corridor resource rights. It was the kind of mission that attracted ceremonial danger in the planning phase and real boredom in execution. An uncomfortable gap between the seriousness of the occasion and the tedium of the actual travel, broken by formal dinners and protocol briefings, and the careful management of who stood next to whom in which room. Mara had done protection work before. She had done it on orbital platforms and ground-side government buildings, and once on a terrestrial convoy that was supposed to be low risk and wasn't, a memory she kept filed under lessons, not trauma. The theory of protection was simple: put yourself between the principal and whatever wanted to hurt the principal. The practice was less simple, because whatever wanted to hurt the principal tended to be creative about it, and because you often didn't know it was coming until it was close enough to smell. She spent her first 18 hours learning the ship. The Vethari vessel Saren Val was a needle of pale alloy roughly 400 meters stem to stern, its corridors lit in a blue-spectrum bioluminescent array that the alien crew found calming, and that gave every human who walked through it the look of a corpse at the bottom of a clean lake. The environmental systems ran at a humidity level Mara found deeply unpleasant, not dramatically so, not the kind of thing you filed complaints about, just the constant low-level awareness of breathing air that had more weight to it than it should. She said nothing about this. She mapped emergency egress routes, noted the placement of what appeared to be structural load-bearing points, cataloged the weapons a Vethari crewman carried on standard watch rotation, and cross-referenced them against the threat assessment files she'd memorized on the transit shuttle from Procyon. She walked the cargo hold twice. She ate a functional meal in the secondary crew mess rather than the human liaison dining space, because the secondary crew mess had bet her sightlines to the aft maintenance corridor. Her team thought she was being paranoid. Corporal Yoon said as much, with the affectionate exasperation of someone who had worked with her long enough to find it endearing. Her team was probably right. She did it anyway. On the second morning, she found the anomaly. It was subtle, the kind of thing that wasn't there if you didn't know how to look for it, and was completely obvious once you did. A cycling irregularity in the ship's secondary communications array. A repeating pattern at 47-minute intervals that didn't match anything in normal diagnostic noise profiles, that didn't correlate to any external signal source in their current transit corridor, and that had no entry in the Vethari crew's own maintenance logs when Petrov checked. Could be interference from the Procyon gradient, Petrov said, pulling his hair back with both hands in the gesture he used when he was genuinely uncertain. The radiation profile out here is weird, different from anything in the standard library. Could be, Mara agreed. She didn't sleep that night. Not because she was afraid, fear wasn't the right word for what she felt. Something more precise than fear. The uncomfortable awareness that the geometry of a situation was not what it appeared to be, and that, until she understood the correct geometry, everyone around her was positioned wrong. By the third morning, she had a theory. It was the kind of theory that, if she was right, meant everyone on the ship was already in the wrong position. And if she was wrong, she would spend the rest of her career filing incident reports and answering questions from people with better political instincts and worse ones than her. She had been wrong before. She had also been right at the exact moments it counted, and she had learned to trust the feeling that accompanied the theory. Not because the feeling was always correct, but because ignoring it had costs she was no longer willing to pay. She went to see Ambassador Veltarn. He received her in a chamber near the bow called the Contemplation Room, which was the Vethari designation for what amounted to a circular space with a transparent ceiling, currently showing the blurred star lines of transit speed. Elongated light, like someone had grabbed the stars and pulled them toward you. His personal attendants, two younger Vethari in pale ceremonial robes, stood at the periphery and watched her with the unsettled attention the alien species generally directed at humans when they thought humans weren't paying attention. She was always paying attention. "Sergeant," Veltarn said. He was seated on a low structure that served as his resting apparatus, his 4 arms folded across his chest in a posture she'd learned from the cultural briefing documents she'd read twice on the transit shuttle indicated formal receptiveness. "You have something to report." "Yes, sir." She kept her voice professionally flat. No inflection that might read as accusation, no urgency that might read as alarm. "Over the past 36 hours, I've logged a communications irregularity in your secondary array. The cycle pattern doesn't match interference or standard system noise. It's coherent. It's intentional. Someone on this ship is transmitting outbound data on a non-standard protocol." 3 of Veltarn's 4 eyes focused on her. The 4th, the lateral assessment eye, slid toward the attendants at the room's edge. A small movement. Involuntary, she thought. A tell. She filed it. "My crew are cleared to the highest diplomatic level," he said. "They have undergone vetting processes that—" "Crew members can be compromised, sir. The vetting processes that clear them for their normal assignment don't account for approaches made after clearance is granted." She kept her voice level. "Or the transmission source might not be crew at all. There may be a device aboard that doesn't appear in any manifest." Veltarn was quiet for 3 seconds. She had come to understand this as significant. Vethari decision-making in professional contexts was typically immediate. They processed quickly and acted on the result. When they paused, they were weighing something they didn't want to weigh. "You may proceed," he said finally. She turned to leave. "Sergeant." She stopped without turning. Then she turned, because turning was a courtesy and courtesy cost nothing, and she had found it generally bought more than it cost. "The scar," Veltarn said, all 4 eyes on her now. "How did you receive it?" She'd been asked the question before by people who wanted stories, by people who wanted to see if she'd flinch at the memory, by people who were cataloging her in some way they thought was subtle. She gave them all the same answer. The short version, the professional one, without elaboration. Hand-to-hand, sir. Orbital platform 7 years ago. A man with a ceramic blade and a political grievance. And the man. He doesn't have a political grievance anymore. 3 of Veltarn's eyes blinked in sequence. She would learn later that this was the Vethari equivalent of a nod. Petrov found the source in less than 2 hours, which was faster than she'd expected, and suggested he'd been quietly working the problem since she briefed him without her needing to say continue. The transmitter was embedded in a secondary coolant housing on Deck 7, a device the size of a thumb, Vethari manufacture in terms of the physical component, but running a human-coded signal protocol layered over the Vethari base architecture, which was either very clever misdirection designed to point suspicion at the human security complement, or someone's operational mistake born from using equipment sourced from multiple supply chains without fully thinking through what each layer would look like to an analyst. She thought it was the latter. Clever operations didn't usually make that kind of error, but clever operations also failed less often, and this one hadn't failed yet, so she didn't dismiss the former. "Who knows this route?" she asked, standing over the image of the device on Petrov's scanner. "The Accord Navigation Office, the Vethari Diplomatic Corps full stop, the treaty negotiation team on both sides." Lieutenant Os, her second, pulled up the manifest on his tablet. "And anyone those organizations have communicated with in the past 3 weeks, which in diplomatic prep for a treaty signing is essentially everyone with a clearance level above administrative." "So everyone," said Petrov cheerfully. He had a talent for stating grim conclusions without apparent distress that she had always found useful in difficult situations. Mara stared at the transmitter. She did not touch it. You didn't pull a transmitter unless you knew who was listening, or unless you needed to alert the listener intentionally. Pull it too soon, and whoever was receiving the signal would know their asset was burned and would move early on whatever plan the signal was supporting. She wanted to know what they were moving toward and what they were moving toward them. "Leave it," she said. "Keep monitoring the signal frequency and cycle. I need to know the moment anything changes, if the cycle shortens, if the data payload changes, if it drops entirely. Anything." She went back to Veltarn with what they'd found. He took the news with the stillness of someone who had been expecting it and had hoped very much to be wrong. He remained seated and was quiet for a long time after she finished. "The Kethsorian faction," he said, and the name carried a weight she recognized in every culture she'd encountered, the particular heaviness of an old conflict that had settled into the shape of the world and kept reshaping it, never fully resolved and never fully acknowledged as unresolvable. "Tell me about them," she said. He looked at her. A human security specialist asking an ambassador for political intelligence was clearly an unusual dynamic. She held his gaze and waited without apology. She needed to understand what she was protecting him from. He told her. The Kethsorian were a political coalition within Vethari society, not a government, not a military structure, but what the humans would have called an ideological insurgency if they'd been willing to be precise about it. They opposed the Terran Accord Resource Treaty on grounds that represented, depending on which of their public spokespeople was speaking, either principled concern about Vethari cultural sovereignty or a thinly veiled economic protection racket for the Procyon Corridor industrial interests that currently controlled resource extraction without treaty obligations. Possibly both. The Vethari political landscape, Veltarn explained with the patient economy of someone who had been navigating it for decades, did not always distinguish clearly between principle and profit. 3 weeks ago, a Kethsorian operative had been arrested on Procyon Station in possession of forged transit documents, and a weapons cache assessed as sufficient to cause significant casualties in an enclosed space. That operative had been released 48 hours later on a diplomatic technicality involving jurisdiction overlap between the Accord and the Vethari law enforcement structure. "They want you dead," Mara said. It wasn't a question, but she phrased it as a statement because statements invited correction in a way questions sometimes didn't. "They want the treaty dead," Veltarn said. "I am the most direct route to that outcome." "Respectfully, sir, you are the treaty. You have the standing, the relationships, the political capital inside the Vethari diplomatic structure to push this across the line. The negotiating team on both sides has been building toward this signing for 2 years. Without you, the process reverts. The treaty goes back to foundational discussions. In the current political climate, that could take another 4 years. She let that settle. 4 years during which a lot can change. That's worth a great deal to people whose interests the treaty doesn't serve. Veltarn looked at her with all 4 eyes. It was, she was learning, a gesture of full attention, something usually reserved in Vethari interaction for moments of significant consequence. "You understand this very quickly," he said. "I've been in situations that had this shape before," she said. "Not the exact situation, but the same geometry." "And what does the geometry tell you to do?" She'd been working through it for the past hour. A ship in transit, a concealed transmitter, an unknown force on the other end of the signal. They couldn't know what was coming, one vessel or several, a direct assault or something more sophisticated, immediately or timed to a specific coordinate in the transit corridor. What she could know was this: whatever was coming had the advantage of approach. They knew where the Saren Val was, and the Saren Val didn't know where they were. The only way to shift that equation was to take the initiative away from whoever was receiving the signal. "We change course," she said. "Gradually, 5 degrees off the filed transit line, drop to 3/4 speed. Make it look like a navigational correction or a drive variance, something that doesn't read as evasion but affects their intercept timing. And then we prepare to stop being passengers about it," she said. The attack came 6 hours later. Not a fleet, smarter than that. A single Vethari courier vessel running dark on military-grade stealth systems, broadcasting a distress beacon on a harmonic frequency tuned to match the Saren Val's own emergency band. The kind of approach that would trigger the ship's own protocol systems to flag the incoming vessel as a priority rescue contact, requiring mandatory response and docking assistance. Petrov caught it 17 minutes before it would have been inside hailing distance, which was 17 minutes before the docking protocol auto-engagement would have initiated. He flagged it to Mara without comment, just a tap on her shoulder and a turned screen, which she had told him once was her preferred mode of delivery for information that required immediate assessment without immediate words. She was already in the secondary operations center when the alert sounded shipwide. She had not slept. She did not feel the absence of sleep in any way that interfered with function. She had learned, on a number of occasions that ranged from unpleasant to genuinely terrible, that the body enters a specific state when it recognizes a threat is near and has stopped being theoretical. That state was not excitement. It was not the clean high of an adrenaline response. It was something quieter and more durable, a narrowing of everything to the present problem, a suspension of everything that wasn't immediately relevant, a clarity that she had come to think of as the most honest state she ever occupied, because it contained no performance and no uncertainty about what mattered. "That's not a distress beacon," she said, watching the courier's approach vector on the display. The pattern was wrong, too clean, too precisely harmonized to their own emergency band to be coincidental. "That pattern is engineered to trigger our automatic docking protocol. They want us to open a bay and keep it open." "It will trigger it," said Savriel, the Vethari navigation officer assigned to the operations center, a young crewman who had been watching Mara for 2 days with the expression of someone confronting a category they hadn't previously needed. Ship protocol requires response to a distress signal on. Override it, Mara said. I don't have standing authority to override mandatory emergency. Ambassador Veltarn does. She looked at Veltarn, who was standing at the back of the operations center in the posture she had learned to read as his decision posture, still, upright, 3 of 4 eyes tracking. Sir, if we open a docking bay, they're inside our defensive perimeter before we know what they've brought aboard. Whatever comes through that airlock, we're dealing with it in a ship corridor against opponents who have had time to organize and we haven't. I would rather deal with it on my terms, in a position of my choosing, with 30 minutes of preparation. A beat, Veltarn said to Savriel, override it. The navigation officer complied. The courier vessel's profile changed the moment the docking protocol handshake went silent. Stealth systems dropped, not because they'd been detected, Mara judged, but because the plan had moved to its contingency mode and speed now mattered more than concealment. The vessel was smaller than the Saren Val but significantly faster and more maneuverable, and it came in hard on the starboard aft quarter, the angle where the Vethari defensive system coverage was weakest, where the primary sensor array had its longest refresh interval. They had studied the Saren Val's specifications thoroughly. So had she. Petrov. She moved to his station without hurry. Hurry was for when you were behind the situation. She was trying to stay ahead of it. I need access to the secondary comms array. The transmitter's banned. Yes, I want to broadcast on it. She pulled up the signal specifications she'd spent the last 6 hours memorizing, the cycle timing, the data structure, the encoding pattern. If whoever's on that courier is getting signal from our embedded transmitter, I want to continue giving them signal. Something that looks operational. Something that makes them think their asset is still running. Petrov stared at her for approximately 1 second. You want to feed them false navigation data. I want to slow them down, she said, and I want them to be slightly wrong about our position, confident that they're wrong. Not suspicious, not uncertain, confident. That requires us to have their encryption protocol architecture so the signal reads as authentic to their receivers. And we don't. We have their transmitter, she looked at him, a device transmitting in their protocol from inside their operations infrastructure. What does that give us? Petrov was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then he started typing with the focused velocity of someone who had just seen the path. She left him to it and went to brief her team. There were 9 of them on active protection detail. Mara, Petrov, Osai, 4 infantry veterans from various Accord conflict rotations, and 2 specialists whose primary qualification was staying functional in situations that were falling apart around them. She assembled them in the secondary corridor she designated as staging, which had 2 egress routes and no sightlines from the sections of the ship she didn't control. Party, she said without preamble. Arriving via breach, not docking. Could be 4 personnel, could be 12. They'll be Vethari operatives well armed, trained for shipboard close quarters, probably familiar with the Saren Val's internal layout from the schematics they've had access to. She paused. They don't want to destroy the vessel. They want the ambassador specifically, which means they'll prioritize capture over immediate lethality at minimum for the first engagement sequence. That's our window. How long a window? Said Corporal Yoon. 30 seconds at the breach point, maybe less. They'll hesitate when the situation doesn't match their expected parameters. She let that sit a moment. Which means our job is to make sure the situation doesn't match their expected parameters. She walked them through the positions. She used clean language, no optimistic framing. She said what she knew with the confidence of someone who knew it, and she said what she didn't know with the same tone, because in her experience, the distinctions between what you knew and what you were guessing were exactly as important as the substance of either. And soldiers who couldn't make that distinction in the field had a tendency to be very decisive at exactly the wrong moments. When she was done, Private Dalla, the youngest member of the team, said quietly, "It'll work." Mara looked at her. Dalla was 23 and had eyes that had seen more than 23 years should account for, which was the specific kind of person the military manufactured in quantity, and the specific kind of person who occasionally stopped a situation that everyone else had decided was already lost. "Yeah," Mara said, "it will." She turned and went to find the ambassador. He was in the contemplation room again. The star lines on the transparent ceiling had changed angle from the course deviation, and the effect was different than it had been earlier, less motion, more depth, as if the universe had slowed to observe rather than passing through. "You should move to the central stronghold," she told him. "It's shielded, it has redundant comms, and it gives us one choke point to defend instead of 4. "I know what it is," Veltarn said. "I have been in danger before, Sergeant Kessler." She stopped. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before in their interactions. Not fear. She could categorize fear in a dozen species, and this wasn't it. Something denser than fear. Something that fear became if you lived long enough with it and made the decision not to let it govern you, and then had to make that decision again every time a new situation called for it. "When?" she asked. It was a personal question, outside her operational brief. She had learned, imperfectly and at some cost, that personal questions asked at the wrong time were a liability. She asked it anyway. 23 years ago," he said. "My predecessor, the ambassador whose position I eventually assumed, was assassinated during the first attempt at establishing Terran Accord negotiations. A device in the conference room. I was his second. I survived because a piece of structural debris from the initial detonation fell between me and the source and altered the fragmentation pattern." He paused. "I have thought about that piece of structural debris many times." She stood with him in the starlit room and didn't say anything immediately, because the information wasn't requesting response, it was requesting reception. There was a difference. "Why did you continue?" she asked, "after that?" "Because the alternative," he said, "is this. What you see on this ship tonight, the permanent exploitation of the spaces where trust has not yet taken root. Someone always profits from the absence of agreement. Fear of the other is, in my experience, the most reliable industry in any civilization." He was quiet for a moment. "And I am old enough to know that I cannot afford the luxury of being afraid of it." She looked at him. At the 4 eyes, at the ridged spine, at the formal diplomatic bearing he maintained even here, in a ship under threat, in a lit room full of transit-blurred stars. "Sir," she said, "we need to move." He rose from the resting apparatus with a deliberateness she had started to recognize as characteristic. Not slowness, but the measured pace of someone who had decided something and was enacting it without waste or theatrics. "Sergeant," he said, moving with her into the corridor, "I do not intend to die today." "Good," she said, "neither do I." Petrov's false signal bought them 11 minutes. She calculated this afterward when there was time to calculate. In the moment, time operated differently, not slower, which was the popular description, but more granular. More information per unit. The body processing everything and the mind producing an ordering of priorities faster than the language centers could narrate it. The breach came through emergency hatch 7 on the starboard aft, exactly where she'd said it would, at the angle she'd modeled. The sound was a hammer crack that transmitted through the hull and through the deck plating and through the soles of every boot on the ship. A physical announcement that the situation had become the situation. Then a pressurization hiss as the boarding tube sealed. Then the electromagnetic pulse. Small, local, designed to kill the lighting in a 30-meter radius for 3 to 5 seconds. A Kethsorian tactical standard, according to the threat assessment files. Designed to disorient the security response, force a reorientation period during which the boarding party controlled the space. Her team was already on optical enhancement systems. She listened to the boarding party move. They were good, organized, disciplined, quiet in the way that people who have trained repeatedly for a specific task become quiet, the silence of rehearsal, not of caution. 7 operatives by her count of footfall and equipment signature, moving in 3 elements. They cleared the aft section fast, turned toward the route their ship's schematics told them would lead to the ambassador's quarters. They did not expect to find Osai and Yoon behind them. She heard the sounds of it from the stronghold where she held her position alongside the ambassador, Savril, and 3 team members. The sounds lasted longer than she would have chosen if she'd had the choice. They were not clean. Nothing conducted in a narrow corridor with 2 trained elements and 7 armed operatives was ever going to be clean, and anyone who described it otherwise was either describing something else or had not been present for the real version. When it ended, Osai's voice came through her earpiece. Flat, recovered, the voice of someone who had put what they'd just done into the compartment where it would live and was now back in the present. 7 down, 4 incapacitated, 3 neutralized. The ambassador's team is secure. A pause. We have a problem on the courier. She was already moving. The problem on the courier was a person. A signal technician, young, non-combatant, who had apparently been coordinating the false transmitter data and managing the courier's stealth profile from its forward compartment, and who had, upon realizing the boarding party was not responding to check-in protocols, locked themselves into the courier system architecture and begun running an override sequence. Petrov read the sequence off the remote monitoring feed with the specific expression he used for situations that had become significantly more complex than preferred. If that signal completes, it broadcasts on a Vethari military emergency band flagging us as an aggressor vessel. Military response time from the nearest Vethari patrol in this corridor is approximately 2 hours. He looked at her. Even if we talk them down afterward, the incident will have been logged. Both governments will have to manage it. Investigations, testimony. The treaty negotiation is functionally over, not because anyone is dead, but because the political environment around the signing will have collapsed. Mara looked at the sealed hatch of the boarding tube. She looked at the time display on her wrist unit. How long does the override take to complete? At current progress, 9 minutes. Can you interrupt it from here? Not without access to the courier's internal system architecture. Which is inside. Which is inside, he confirmed. She thought about this for the time it took to take one deliberate breath. Open the hatch, she said. Sergeant. The technician is non-combatant. She's scared, she's alone, and she's doing the only thing her training equipped her to do in this scenario, which is complete her objective because that's what trained people do when the surrounding operation falls apart. She pulled her sidearm and checked the indicator without looking at it, muscle memory from 11 years. Open the hatch. I'll handle the rest. Petrov opened the hatch. The boarding tube was 20 meters of narrow alloy passage that smelled of recycled air and the burned Tozone signature of the courier's stealth systems running hard and then cycling down. Mara moved through it at a controlled pace, sidearm down at her side, not holstered, but down, barrel toward the deck. The posture of someone with a weapon who has not decided to use it. There was a language in how you carried a weapon, and it said things before you spoke, and she knew how to speak it. At the far end of the tube, a sealed access door. Through the hull plating, very faint, the continuing electronic rhythm of the override sequence. She knocked on the door. The rhythm paused, then resumed. She knocked again with the same cadence, unhurried. My name is Sergeant Mara Kessler, she said. Her voice was the voice she used when she needed someone to hear that she was not performing comm, that the comm was structural. I'm the human security specialist aboard the Saren Vol. I caught your transmitter on day 2. I disrupted your boarding party's docking approach with a false beacon. I set up the ambush in Corridor Junction 7. A pause. I'm telling you this so you understand I'm not guessing about your operation's current status." The rhythm of the override sequence continued, but the pace had shifted slightly. She noted it. "Your boarding party is incapacitated. Your distress signal is your last available action. But here is the problem with your last action. It doesn't achieve your faction's actual objective." She kept her voice even, not aggressive, not gentle, accurate. "The objective is the treaty. Killing or capturing the ambassador ends the treaty directly. But a military incident also ends it messier, more publicly, with more documentation of what happened on this ship and who arranged it. That documentation will eventually reach people inside your own organization who don't know the full scope of tonight's operation. Some of those people will not be pleased. Intelligence on internal fractures within the Kethsorian is exactly the kind of thing that investigations generate." Another pause. "You are the person in your operation right now with the most information and the most options, not your leadership, who can't see what you can see from inside that compartment. You." Silence. The override rhythm slowed. Didn't stop, slowed. She kept talking. "I don't know how you came to be on this courier. I don't know what you were told this operation was. I know that the boarding party was carrying lethal weapons capability, and I'm guessing you didn't know that when you accepted whatever you were told this mission was." She felt the shape of the conversation in the silence from the other side of the door, not agreement, but listening. Someone listening was most of what she needed. That distinction matters. It will matter a great deal in what happens next. The distinction between what you knew and what you did, and what you didn't know and what you did instead, is something that people who review these situations pay attention to. A very long silence. The override sequence stopped. The door unlocked. The technician was young, late adolescence by Veltarn's assessment later, when Mara gave him the full account. She had been recruited through an ideological network at a Vethari university, approached by someone who had presented the operation as a treaty disruption mission, a signal intercept and political document, a bloodless technical operation. She had not known about the weapons the boarding party was carrying. She had not, it became clear during the conversation in the courier's forward compartment, known that anyone was going to be hurt. Mara sat with her for 40 minutes while the Vethari crew secured the vessel, and Petrov extracted the transmitter protocols from the courier's system architecture. The technician didn't speak much. Mara didn't push. She had learned this was not something she'd been taught. It was something she'd arrived at through the accumulation of situations where pushing had not worked and not pushing had, that the period immediately after someone's plan collapsed around them was not the time to interrogate or to press or to make use of the available leverage. It was the time to be a steady presence. Not warm, exactly. Not reassuring in the way that tried to minimize what had happened. Just present. Solid. Proof that the air in the room was still breathable. After a long while, the technician said, in the standard trade language, "How did you know I would stop?" Mara thought about it honestly. "I didn't," she said. "I thought you probably would. The probability favored it. But I wasn't certain." The technician looked at her. "That is an unusual thing to say for someone in your position." "I've found that being honest about uncertainty makes people more likely to extend the same courtesy," Mara said, "which tends to produce better outcomes than pretending to know things I don't." The lateral eye, the assessment eye, fixed on her for a moment. "You are strange," the technician said, "for a human." "I've been told that before," Mara said. The Saren Val reached Meridian 7 station 19 hours behind schedule, which occasioned a considerable amount of diplomatic communication management that Commander Issel handled with the weary competence of a man who had spent his career in the gap between what had happened and what the official timeline showed. Ambassador Veltarn filed a joint incident report with the Vethari Diplomatic Corps and the Terran Accord Security Office simultaneously and without prior coordination with either party, a choice that was itself a signal, read immediately by anyone watching. transparency applied symmetrically, no narrative advantage being shaped on either side. The Kethsorian faction would face internal consequences. The political landscape around the treaty would shift, not because anyone had been publicly destroyed, but because the documentation now existed, and documentation had a way of ending up in the hands of the people most interested in it. The treaty negotiation would proceed, delayed by 2 weeks to allow additional security protocols to be established for the formal signing. Veltarn summoned Myra to the contemplation room one final time before the ship docked. She stood in the posture she defaulted to when she didn't know what register a conversation was going to take, hands behind her back, weight balanced, face in the neutral position that her training had given her and that 11 years had made automatic. "The young technician," Veltarn said, before she expected him to speak. "I understand you remained with her for an extended period after the vessel was secured." "Yes, sir." "Why?" She thought about it. The honest answer was several things braided together that didn't separate cleanly. Operational utility. Someone frightened and alone in custody after the collapse of their operation was a less reliable source of accurate information than someone who felt heard, and she needed accurate information about the Kethsorians' operational scope. And something older than operational utility, something that lived further back in her. The recognition that the technician had been young and had been badly led, and had made decisions she couldn't fully unmake, and that sitting with her cost nothing except time, and that time spent that way had a specific quality she couldn't reduce to efficiency. She was somebody's kid, Mara said. Veltarn was still for a long moment. It wasn't the stillness of processing or of weighing. It was the stillness of recognition. "Yes," he said, "she was." He was quiet again. Then, "A vessel that has survived the pressure test holds. This is something we say. I told you I had thought it was from our building traditions. I believe now it describes something broader." He looked at her scar, not the sideways assessment she'd seen before, but directly, with the full forward-facing gaze. "You have survived many pressure tests." "A few," she said. "And you hold." She didn't answer immediately. The honest answer was that holding was a choice made repeatedly, not a condition you arrived at and maintained automatically. It required the decision each time. Sometimes it was easier than others. "I try to," she said. The signing ceremony was held in the Accord's main conference hall on Meridian 7, a vast transparent structure that looked out onto the station's exterior ring, and the 2 stars of the Procyon system burning at a distance that made them seem patient. Human and Vethari astronomers had been arguing companionably about the naming conventions for those stars for 30 years. The treaty being signed in this room would eventually settle the argument in favor of a hybrid designation that neither side had proposed and both sides could accept, which was, Mara thought, probably a reasonable description of what a successful treaty looked like. She stood at her post inside the chamber door. She was not watching the ambassador. She was watching the room, all of it, the weight distribution of the assembled dignitaries, the 3 Kethsorian observers admitted under diplomatic courtesy, who stood at the back with the particular stillness of people who had decided not to act and had not yet fully made peace with that decision. She caught the eye of the one closest to the door, held it without expression, not challenge, not threat, just acknowledgement. She was there. She knew he was there. He understood that she understood what he was. He looked away first. She didn't experience this as a victory. It was a data point. It told her the calculation had changed. Whatever the Kethsorian had assumed about the Terran Accord's human security specialists, ceremonial, deferential, secondary actors in a Vethari-managed operation, the events on the Saren Val had revised that assumption. She'd seen it in the observer's posture from the moment she'd walked into this room. Not fear. Something more calibrated than fear. Recognition of a variable they had underestimated. She had no interest in being feared. She had a very specific interest in being accurately understood. Veltarn signed the treaty at the 15th hour of the station cycle. The room did not erupt. It exhaled, a collective release of long-held tension that moved through the assembled dignitaries like a pressure change, a sound that was barely audible but that the body registered as clearly as a bell. Something that had been under sustained pressure for 2 years and several decades before that, a long project of careful human and Vethari labor, had arrived at its first completion. Mara watched the room, not the moment. But she felt the exhale pass through her too. In the transit corridor afterward, Ambassador Veltarn stopped at her post. "Sergeant." "Sir." He looked at the scar. The way he'd looked at it in the docking bay on Procyon, when she was still just a file designation. But the look was different now. It had acquired the quality of things looked at by someone who understood them. "Does it trouble you?" he asked. "The scar?" She considered the question with the honesty it deserved, because she'd found that the ambassador deserved honesty in proportion to the directness of his questions, and his questions were always direct. "Sometimes," she said, "when it's cold. And otherwise." She thought about the orbital platform 7 years ago, about the 4 hours after the blade before the medical bay, completing the assignment, about the young technician in the courier's forward compartment, about a piece of structural debris that fell at an angle one had chosen and changed the arc of 2 species' relationship to each other. "Otherwise," she said, "I've stopped noticing it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that is not entirely true." She said nothing. "I think you notice it every day," he said, "and that every day you choose to find it unremarkable. These are different things." He paused. "This is a discipline I am still learning, to hold a thing that happened and not be reshaped by it entirely, to carry it without letting it become the primary fact." She looked at him, at all 4 eyes on her, at the full attention. "You'll get there," she said. 3 eyes blinked in sequence. "Yes," he said. "I believe I will." They wrote about the Meridian 7 signing in the diplomatic histories. They wrote about the treaty language and the negotiating teams and the Kethsorian incident and the security protocols implemented afterward. It was careful prose, accurate in its facts and incomplete in its understanding, as official histories tended to be. What didn't make it into the diplomatic histories was most of what mattered. It didn't make it in that Sergeant Mara Kessler had spent 48 sleepless hours mapping a ship she hadn't been aboard before, because that was what you did when people's lives were your responsibility, and you weren't willing to substitute procedures for attention. It didn't make it in that she'd talked a frightened young technician down from a decision that would have ended 2 years of careful work, using nothing except honesty and patience, and the willingness to be present in an uncomfortable corridor for 40 minutes, without needing the situation to resolve on her schedule. It didn't make it in that she'd held eye contact with a Kethsorian observer across a treaty signing ceremony until he looked away, which was a small thing, the kind of thing that happens in rooms where history is made and gets attributed to the people at the table rather than the people standing at the door. It didn't make it in that she was 34 years old and scarred, and had 11 years of accumulated decisions behind her, and found this sufficient. Not comfortable, not settled, not certain, sufficient. The way a vessel finds sufficiency in having held under the conditions that were meant to break it. The Terran Accord Resource Treaty generated 14 follow-on agreements over the subsequent decade. It opened the Procyon corridor to joint development. It produced the economic conditions that funded the first permanent human Vethari research station at the system boundary, where astronomers from both species eventually agreed on a naming convention for the 2 stars they'd been arguing about since first contact. 3 universities eventually named research chairs after Ambassador Veltarn. Nobody named anything after Sergeant Mara Kessler. She would have found this funny if she'd known. She was, by then, 3 assignments down the line from Meridian 7, standing in a different doorway on a different ship in a different system, watching a different room with the same eyes. The scar was the same. Cold still found it sometimes. She still noticed it every day and still chose, every day, to find it unremarkable. This was the discipline. She was very good at it. The Vethari would come to say in the years that followed that the human gift was not strength. There were stronger species, and not intelligence. There were smarter ones, and not longevity, certainly not that. The closest any of their scholars came to naming it was during a symposium on interspecies cooperation conducted 8 years after Meridian 7, in a paper that was cited more than any other document from that period. The scholar wrote, "Humans are the only species we have encountered that can be broken and choose, deliberately, to regard this as inconclusive. They appear to treat survival not as the end of a process but as the beginning of the next one. We do not fully understand this. We believe it may be the most important thing about them." Mara Kessler never read the paper. She was busy. She was always busy. There was always a room to watch, a door to hold, someone worth standing in front of. And she had decided, the way she decided everything, without announcement, without drama, with the patient economy of someone who had learned that a decision made once and honored daily was more durable than any decision made loudly. She had decided this was enough. It was. It had always been. She had taken the assignment, 4 months ago, from a routing officer who had looked at her file for approximately 6 seconds and then looked at her. "Vethari diplomatic protection," the officer had said. 3 days, routine transit, you'd be the senior on a complement of 22. "Routine transit," she'd repeated. "That's what the brief says." She had said yes because that was what she did. She said yes to the assignments that other people categorized as routine, and then she treated them the way she treated everything, which was to say she treated them as if they contained the potential for every outcome, including the ones no brief mentioned. This had been characterized, at various points in her career, as excessive, as methodological, as inspiring, and as exhausting. She had been all 4 things at different times and on different days, and occasionally within the same operation. What she knew, having been doing this long enough to have learned what she knew rather than what she'd been told, was that the difference between a routine operation and a non-routine operation was very rarely in the briefing material. It was in the variable that the briefing material didn't have, the piece of information that hadn't surfaced yet, the decision someone made in a room that nobody documented. The 47-minute cycle in a secondary communications array that looked like radiation interference until it didn't. You protected against the known threats with procedures and preparation. You protected against the unknown threats by learning everything about the space you were in and the people who occupied it and the pressures they were under, so that, when the unknown threat took a shape, you had enough context to recognize it before it introduced itself. This was, in sum, how she thought about her work. It was not particularly dramatic as a philosophy. It was effective. She had met Ambassador Veltarn for the first time in the docking bay at Procyon Station, in the organized chaos of a diplomatic departure that involved 4 separate protocol teams, a translator's dispute about the precedence order for the formal greeting sequence, and a Vethari junior attaché who kept trying to take Mara's arm and was becoming confused about why this wasn't working. Veltarn had watched the confusion with 3 of his 4 eyes for approximately 10 seconds. Then he had said something in his own language, low, brief, and the junior attaché had stopped. He'd looked at Mara after that with the 4th eye, the lateral one, the assessment instrument. "You do not like to be guided," he said. It was not a question. "I need to be able to move," she said. "If someone's holding my arm, I can't move freely." "You could explain this to my attaché and save him the confusion." "I could," she agreed. But then he'd spend the rest of the transit overthinking every interaction with me, which would distract him from his actual job. Better that he simply learns the practical outcome. Veltarn had looked at her for a moment. Then 3 of his 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a gesture she hadn't yet learned to read, and he had turned and walked aboard his ship. She had followed, and then she had started learning the ship. There was a specific quality to the 3rd night of a transit mission that she had noticed across many years and many transit missions, and had never found a clean way to describe. Not the 1st night, which was all attention and new information and the adrenaline of a new space. Not the 2nd night, which was the grinding work of tracking everything you'd learned and watching for what it implied. But the 3rd night, when you'd been awake long enough that the fatigue was no longer the sharpness of sleeplessness, but something more fundamental, when the body had burned through its reserves and was operating on something purer and harder to name, that 3rd night had a specific texture. She had been awake for 51 hours when Osai's voice came through her earpiece to report the boarding party down. The fatigue was present. She noted it the way she noted the humidity of the Sarin Val's corridors or the temperature in the operations center or the faint recurring chime of the override sequence through the boarding tube hull. Information, a variable, not a constraint, because she had learned that fatigue became a constraint only when you began to negotiate with it, and she didn't negotiate with it. She walked through the breach site on her way to the boarding tube. She looked at what had happened in Corridor Junction 7 with the same eyes she used for everything. She noted the positions. She noted the outcomes. She noted the things her team had done that she would note in their formal assessments. Yoon's positioning had been exemplary. Osai's timing had been exact. And she noted the one thing that had not gone as planned, which was that the element lead for the starboard approach had been slightly slow on confirmation. A hesitation of perhaps 2 seconds that in a different configuration could have mattered. She would address this in the debrief, not as criticism, as information incorporated so that the next time none of them were slower than they needed to be. The Meridian 7 station was a structure that humans had built and that both species used, which meant it had been built for human environmental requirements and then subsequently modified at considerable expense to accommodate Vethari physiological preferences and aesthetic values. The result was a facility that suited neither species perfectly and suited both species adequately, which was perhaps the most accurate built environment metaphor for what the treaty was attempting. The conference hall where the signing took place occupied the station's uppermost ring, where the transparent walls curved outward to give a panoramic view of space that the architects had clearly intended as meaningful, and which Mara found aesthetically impressive and operationally inconvenient, because panoramic transparent walls meant sightlines she couldn't control. She had done 3 walkthroughs of the space before the ceremony, and had placed her team at the angles she could control, and had made her peace with the ones she couldn't. The ceremony had lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes, standard diplomatic duration, she was told afterward, for a signing of this significance. She had not experienced it as 2 hours and 14 minutes. She had experienced it as a continuous present, the kind of sustained attention that had no internal duration, that was simply itself, complete, until the document was sealed and the exhale moved through the room, and she was standing in slightly different air. The Kethsorian observer had left shortly after the signing, without incident, with the posture of someone who has absorbed a significant revision to their understanding of the situation and has not yet determined what to do with it. She had tracked his departure with her peripheral vision until he was through the door, and then she had stopped tracking him, because the door was the threshold of her responsibility, and once he crossed it, he was someone else's. She had held the door. She had done her job. Commander Issel found her in the debriefing room 3 hours after the ceremony concluded, while her team was processing incident documentation, and Petrov was compiling the transmitter analysis for the Accord Security Office. You're going to be in a lot of report paperwork, Issel said. He had the look of a man who had been managing things for the past 6 hours on inadequate sleep and no satisfaction yet. I know, she said. The Vethari Diplomatic Corps wants a full account. The Accord wants a full account. There's going to be a joint review board. You'll be in front of it for at least 2 sessions. I know, she said again. Issel sat down across from her. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. For what it's worth, he said, and stopped, started again. The treaty is signed, because you were on that ship. She thought about this, about what was actually true in the statement, and what was the narrative simplification that made things easier to attribute. The treaty is signed because 2 years of diplomatic work produced a document worth signing, she said, and because the ambassador was willing to trust a judgment that could have gone wrong, and because a young technician in a courier forward compartment made a better decision than the people who recruited her. She paused. I was one factor. Issel looked at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone who had expected a different kind of response and was recalibrating. Yes, he said after a moment. I suppose you were. She went back to the documentation. She wrote her formal assessment on the transit back to Accord space, in the kind of clean, precise language that official assessments required. What happened, what decisions were made, what the outcomes were, what should be done differently. The assessment was thorough. It was honest about where her team had exceeded her expectations and where they had operated precisely to standard, and where the one hesitation in the starboard approach element had occurred and what its implications were. She wrote a separate note, not formal, not filed, about the young technician, about the 40 minutes in the courier's forward compartment, about what she'd said and what the technician had said and what the silence between the talking had contained. She wrote it not because anyone would read it, but because some things deserved to be put in words as a matter of clarity, so that you could look at what you'd thought and know whether you'd actually thought it or only believed you had. She read it once, decided it was accurate, and did not read it again. The scar was, as it sometimes was on long transits in temperature-controlled air, faintly uncomfortable, not painful, the healed tissue catching the cool, recycled atmosphere at a frequency that the undamaged skin around it didn't register. She noticed it. She decided, as she decided every time she noticed it, to find it unremarkable. The ship carried her through transit speed toward the next assignment, toward the next room, toward the next door she would stand at and watch and hold as long as it needed to be held. She was ready. She was always ready. That was the thing about humans that the Vethari scholar had tried to name and partially succeeded at. The ones who had survived the thing that was supposed to stop them didn't walk away from it changed into something else. They walked away from it still themselves, carrying the scar and the cold that found it sometimes, carrying the memory of the corridor and the 40 minutes and the piece of debris that fell at the right angle, carrying all of it without being held by any of it. Not because they were stronger than the weight. Because they had decided, repeatedly, daily, without announcement, that the weight was theirs to carry and the walking was theirs to continue. This was the human gift. Veltarn had seen it in a docking bay in the line of a scar. The scholar had named it in a symposium paper that would outlast them both. Mara Kessler would never name it at all. She just did it. Day after day, door after door, room after room. She held. She thought, on the last night of the transit back, about what Veltarn had said, about the piece of structural debris that had fallen between him and the explosive device 23 years ago and changed the arc of a century, about the way he'd returned to it, not with grief or gratitude exactly, but with the steady attention of someone who has taken a fact seriously for a very long time. She thought about her own debris, the decisions that had fallen at angles she hadn't chosen, the orbital platform, the ceramic blade, the 4 hours, the signal anomaly in a secondary array, the knock on a courier's sealed door. The pieces of debris that fall your way, you don't choose. What you build from where they put you, that part is yours. She closed her eyes in the dim of the transit cabin and she felt the cold at her cheek and she let it be what it was, information only, and she slept for the first time in 3 days, and her sleep was very deep, and when she woke she was ready again. She was always ready. That was the thing about her. That was the thing about all of them.